Ian Caveney from BT. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's you were cheeky by not giving people the both options, because I think you have to recognise that whilst there is, the undoubted opportunity from tech, you absolutely, and as Frankie highlighted, you really have to be mindful of the unintended consequences, but also, the broader issues around e-waste, circularity. These are all critical things. So I think what for me becomes really important is the idea of transparency in terms of what you're doing as an organization, what you're delivering, how you're driving, awareness of these issues within the company, such as unintended issues around data, these sort of things that are really critical to an organization. So I think more and more what's interesting is that there's a groundswell around organizations focusing on this, and those that focus on it will hopefully be the ones that actually succeed in the long term.
So building on what Frankie offered us, you're already bringing new terms to us. You're discussing e-waste there, circularity. So you're at BT. Just give us an overview, I suppose, of where you personally and BT as a whole, where you're at with this sustainability journey. Where's BT's point in this journey?
Yeah, well, it's really good to say that BT has been active in climate space for a number of years, and it predates. I joined BT when they bought E in 2015, so a lot of the activity predates my time here. So for example, back in 2008, they were one of the first companies to set a science-based target. So the idea of first of all, when it comes to climate, focusing on the science is a really critical thing that has been embedded in the organisation, and secondly, having those types of targets in place and actually agreed at board level, CEO level, where there's buy-in to achieving these goals is critical. So another example is that in line with the Paris Agreement, we've set a science-based target to reduce our emissions, carbon emissions, in line with the 1.5 degrees heating scenario. So that essentially means that we've got to reduce our emissions by 87% against the 2014 baseline by 2030. So again, these are active major targets that are driving action in the business. And again, we were proud to be one of the first FTSE 100 companies to set a net zero target in 2018 of it being net zero by 2045. So there's I think the first place to sort of start is by having targets and measuring what your carbon impact is really critical. And that then helps drive action across the organisation.
Right. So targets, that fairly bold goal you offered there, net zero by, was it 2045? You said you're finding that actual focus is a big driver.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, when we kind of announced that target back in 2018, not so many people actually were setting net zero targets. So kind of it was basically obviously in the following years where it's become more prevalent. And some of our competitors have set more ambitious targets now. And so it's interesting that there is groundswell around this area in terms of driving action. But for example, I mean, one of the critical things that any organisation can do in its decarbonisation strategies is to think about renewables. And so, last year we managed to achieve a target of being 100% renewable in terms of electricity worldwide. So, that in itself is reducing, our own carbon footprint. But now, for example, our supply chain accounts for roughly 2/3 of our overall carbon emissions. So, that is where some of the problems are, and that's again why things like SME action, etc., is critical, because SMEs again make up a large number of our supply chain. So things like the SME Climate Hub and the work that the government are looking to do around driving that awareness is critical. But as we well know, that if you work in a small company, it's hard enough to keep your head above water often, let alone worry about climate issues, climate targets. So there's a lot of support and kind of, I think, education that needs to be happening in this space, and that's why events like this are great. But equally, things like COP26 happening this year, I think, are hopefully going to be pivotal in sort of again getting climate action on the table and getting everyone to think about it, not only as a business but as individuals.
So again, there's quite complex relationships going on here. You're talking about the relationship between government and business, but interesting there, it's good to hear you talk about the relationship between BT as a major corporate and the SMEs in its supply chain. It sounds like the communication and the relationship between you and your SME suppliers is something you're taking quite seriously.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you take our supply chain, we've obviously got major companies like Apple. We obviously sell a lot of iPhones, Samsung, etc. So we've got the big tech companies in that supply chain. But yeah, at the same time, we've got lots of smaller businesses, and again, rolling out network infrastructure. There's lots of different companies involved in that type of work, as well as our 5G infrastructure. So that we obviously have them in our supply chain. We also have a large customer base of SMEs as well. So that the whole point around education, and also picking on Frankie's point around digital skills and understanding, the opportunities of digital transformation, that I think becomes very symbiotic in that sense.
Sure. So you're very much part of a community within your industry, giving and taking knowledge and good practice.
That's the idea. Yeah, that's what we aim to do.
Now, I've got a few questions lined up for you, but please, everyone, don't hold back in pitching in with your questions to Ian. And Ian and I, we can keep an eye on that chat, so we can either pick them up sort of towards the end, or we might even just pick them out as you type them. So Ian and I will keep an eye on your questions. Do feel free to pitch in and tap something there if it's something you'd like to know more about. Now, a big part of what Frankie offered us, Ian, was about that relationship between technology and sustainability. Now, you're obviously a business for whom technology is at the core of what you do. Has that made it easier or more challenging for you to enact good sustainability practices?
It's a really good question. I think it's something that is implicit in a lot of what the organisation already does, actually. But at the same time, one of my roles is actually trying to make it more explicit in that sense. So, if you take our organisation as a whole, BT is currently in the process of making, what we call a once in a lifetime investment in UK's digital infrastructure through fibre and 5G. And I think we like to believe that investment, that infrastructure, can be a platform for this technological growth. So again, it's not just BT who will be utilising that. It's obviously lots of different players will be able to use that infrastructure to drive that, I suppose the green recovery, the regeneration from COVID-19. And I think underpinning that is the data out there. And again, going back to is tech part of the problem or part of the solution? I think generally, obviously, I fall on the optimistic side of that. And there's studies out there from Ericsson or Jesse, where essentially technology itself can enable carbon abatement by 15 to 20% versus what it produces. So there are different views in that, but I think it is this idea of how to drive the innovation in this place is one of the challenges. A colleague of mine came up with a great quote, which is, you can't buy a smart city off the shelf. So when people talk about these ideas of smart cities and all these transformational things, it's not something you can just do in a click of the finger. It is really about changing ecosystems. It's about digital transformation, and it is this idea of thinking about starting bottom up basically, picking different areas one by one and thinking, well, how can we improve that? How can we make that more resilient? How can we make that more energy efficient? How can we enable more to be done with less? So that there's lots of challenges in that, but again, the opportunities around, and as Frankie said, around things like IoT, its ability to help measure and to sort of really actually understand what you're doing in the first place is really important, actually. So then you can even take action, and also futures around autonomous driving, autonomous cars, etc. That it is again quite exciting, but there's huge societal transformation that needs to happen to support these things. So it's an amazing challenge, but I think what I'm finding is that in terms of conversations I have with colleagues in the business, nobody's really questioning if we should be trying to solve these problems. It is more a question mark of how do we start to solve these problems. So it's a question of how rather than why or if. So I think that's at least a positive starting point. But yeah, there's a lot to do.
Now, in terms of that how and how to get started on that big pile of lots of things to do, I've heard about the Green Tech Innovation Platform. Is that a BT scheme? Is that a BT based platform?
Yeah, it is, and it's a good example. I mean, it's probably one of the main focuses of my role at the moment, actually, in terms of driving that. And I think that was going back to the point around, well, where do you start? So already we know, and obviously meetings like we're doing here on Zoom or video conferencing in the past, these are all products and services that help people save carbon. So BT itself, if you look at our product portfolio, actually, that those services alone have helped our customers in 2019 save 13 million tons of carbon. So existing technologies is already having a good impact on carbon abatement. But with the Green Tech Innovation Platform, what we want to do is to kind of take a different look at things and think about actually, well, how can we actually commercialize new types of technology that is supporting climate action? So I've been working closely with my colleagues in our enterprise business unit, and essentially what we've done there is to think about a focus point. So what we've done with the Green Tech Innovation Platform is first of all, think about how we can, in the first instance, support some of our public sector customers in their net zero transition. And then against that, what we did is sort of create sort of 3 different work streams around smart buildings. So for example, how can we use IoT to support action within social housing? We've got another work stream which is called Smart Streets, which is looking at our street hub units, which is essentially the payphones of the 21st century. How can we incorporate air quality monitoring into those to help drive climate action? And also thirdly, looking at remote diagnostics as an area in terms of helping reduce travel and to sort of improve access to services. And within those 3 areas, what we've then done is work with an organization called Plug and Play. Now, Plug and Play are an international scouting organization, and through that process, we've actually appointed 2 new scale-ups through that work. So in the social housing space, we're working with a company called IOPT, a Glasgow-based startup who have a brilliant social housing solution. What they've got is a great platform. What we've got is a network services that can go around that, and obviously a large public sector customer base. Sure. And in addition to that, we've working with a French startup called Ever Impact, who are actually a really interesting case. This one actually is looking at measuring CO2 emissions and air quality monitoring solutions. But then from that, once you know what the data is and you're taking action against that, how you can actually turn that data and those actions like traffic calming activities at a local council level into generating things like carbon credits, so carbon offsets. So there's some really innovative tech out there, and so a lot of it now is just working on proof of concepts, creating those solutions.
And again, about relationships, not just public sector, private sector relationships, but public sector relationships as well. It sounds like a conversation with a lot of different parties, and the more you can share and collaborate, it sounds like the more you can get things done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's totally recognizing that any organization or anybody from any organization on this meeting today, you're not going to do it on your own. You absolutely have to do it with your customers. You have to look at, scale up partners. You have to look at your existing partners in terms of how you can drive it. But yeah, I think it's by doing, you create the right conditions to get people interested and to drive more action.
What sort of challenges do people need to be aware of? This is a big task. It's a positive task, but what are the challenges? What are the hurdles? What have you noticed?
Yeah, prioritization, I think is the biggest challenge. Is knowing where to start. So again, if I use the green tip as a good example, we with the enterprise business unit, they have SME customers, they have corporate customers, they have public sector customers. So when we were looking at where to focus a project around innovation, we had to pick, where to start, because if we tried to do everything, we would get nowhere. So I think prioritization is a critical thing against that. And it's almost, I think, I would also say just ensuring that the organization as a whole is embedding this into its strategy now is imperative. I think, again, so Frankie mentioned that, in a FTSE 100 company like BT, our investors expect us to be climate leaders. You cannot not take action. So I think, the buy-in from the top is essential, which then enables the rest of the business to fall behind it. But again, not every business has that buy-in, that support from the top of the house. So it's imperative that colleagues or those working in sustainability teams or those walking across broader parts of the business are doing what they can to ensure that the sustainability element of the strategy appears on the company strategy. It's not just oh, by the way, there's sustainability stuff happening over there. It has to appear on that front slide of the overall company strategy. Otherwise, you're going to struggle to get anywhere.
Now, we know from that poll we looked at earlier that people are very much at different stages of this journey. Some have a fully formed strategy and are working to make it count. Others perhaps are early on in that journey, and that strategy is either being put together at the moment or possibly it needs revision or adjustment. In your view, what should people bear in mind when taking on that task of assessing a sustainability strategy? What should be in there? What should be avoided?
Point number one, I think, is start to measure, start to understand where you're at, or what is your carbon footprint. And I think there's more and more tools being developed, and there are, there's the likes of PwC, who've got very big strategic organisation who can help in that. There are other smaller sort of sustainability agencies who can help in that if you're kind of at a smaller organisation stage, just to almost get you started. And even organisations like Business in the Community, they have a lot of resources and advice that lots of different organisations can use. So I think sort of recognising you've got to start somewhere, I suppose, is an important thing. And then start by, I think, just getting some simple measures and simple actions in place. The simplest one I would say is switch to renewables as quickly as you can. And just sometimes for a smaller organisation that actually might be easier than a larger organisation, because that's going to have a very positive impact on your carbon footprint straight away. And I think maybe it's finally, again, not only having on the strategy, but also engaging your colleagues and the other parts of the organisation around it is a critical thing. It's not just a thing that sits with one person's responsibility. It's the responsibility of everybody in an organisation to make these things work.
So, I mean, for some organisations, you've already said some businesses find themselves in a position where the shareholders, the leaders, are already recognising that and setting that expectation. But let's be frank about the fact that for some businesses, that buy-in might not be there. That leadership might not be fully sold on this. The shareholders might not be fully sold on this. Do you have any ideas or advice for the way people may want to approach that situation? If you find yourself trying to encourage a more sustainably focused way of working, how do you have those conversations?
It's a good question. I suppose I'm very lucky that I'm in an organisation where we don't necessarily have that challenge. I mean, I think it's often about and I suppose it requires people to be a bit brave sometimes to potentially call out actions or behaviour that they think is not necessarily right for the organisation. And I think it's kind of doing nothing is sometimes, I suppose, you're part of the problem if you don't do anything. And so I think there's probably, I'd say to people, try to be brave, or look at simple things that you think, well, actually, what in my job I could execute a small bit of change by actually thinking about how we could use less packaging or less plastic. And one example is even back in the day when, if people remember, when SIM cards used to come as like it's credit card sized.
Yeah. And
what you just do then is pop out a small bit of SIM card with a bit of plastic. You're just like, when you're left with this stupid massive bit of plastic. So again, that was just down to one colleague went, that's just daft. Why are we doing that? So, often, and that person then just sort of changed the supply chain and worked on a different solution to how we now provide SIM cards and how that works. So there is, I suppose, it's a classic. Just look at your own role, look at what you do yourself, and just think, are there any small changes I can do to actually make changes? And I think it's definitely, try and be brave. I suppose it's not always easy, but yeah.
So it's almost the big stuff in tandem with the small stuff. Find the bravery and the leadership to have those big conversations, set those big targets at the same time as not missing opportunities that you've identified to make those small, realistic changes that you can make here and now and lead by example.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's find other like-minded people in your organisation. I mean, my wife actually works in quite a small SME, and she comes home with tales of woe about how it organises itself, and but she's trying to exact change. And again, you're dealing with people who don't see this as important. But I think maybe it's, again, I thought Frankie's points at the start were really important. Is that companies that don't adapt, don't change, aren't going to be the ones that survive. They're not going to be the ones who get the right employees. They're not going to be the ones who survive in this world. So it's kind of, it's down to the businesses to think about how they can deliver.
That's a brilliant point for us to end on, I think, the fact that this is no longer an extra, a nice to have. This is actually now core to business expectations, core to the way we work, and you need to get on this, or you're going to be ultimately the odd one out. And with organisations like BT kind of leading the way like this, setting precedents, perhaps it's going to get easier for the rest of us.
Let's hope so. Yeah, I think if people take any bits of advice from what's going on, I've seen some of the questions. I'll just put some links and other things into the chats so people can get access to some of the other bits of advice.
I see Faye from AstraZeneca there is asking if you could mention again, maybe you could do that in the chat, just mention those technology vendors, innovation vendors you mentioned earlier. That would be a really useful resource.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the chat to an event we ran actually at the end of Jan that announced them, so you can actually sort of hear about solutions firsthand, and I'll put a couple of press releases in there as well.
That'd be fantastic. Ian Caveney, Head of Tech for Good at BT. That's been really good to see how such a recognisable brand as BT is leading the way and collaborating like that. Big thanks to you, Ian.